first thing I noticed was that the basement light was on. I know that sounds like nothing. It sounds like exactly the kind of thing you'd gloss over on any other night. But I hadn't been in the basement that day. I hadn't been down there in almost a week, and I have this thing where I always turn lights off when I leave a room. Not because I'm particularly disciplined about it, just habit. My mom drilled it into me when I was a kid, and it stuck. So when I came downstairs at 11:20 at night to get a glass of water and saw that thin yellow line of light bleeding out from under the basement door, I stopped. I stood in the kitchen for a second, holding the empty glass. The refrigerator was humming. The ceiling light above the sink buzzed faintly the way it always did. Everything was the same as it always was at 11:20 on a Tuesday night. I told myself I must have gone down there earlier in the week and forgotten. I told myself it was nothing. And then I opened the basement door and reached inside and turned the light off, and I went back to bed. That should have been the end of it. It probably would have been if that had been the only thing. My girlfriend was visiting her sister in Portland. She'd been gone since Friday, and she wasn't coming back until the following Wednesday. We've been together for 4 years, and she travels for work a few times a year, so I was used to being in the apartment alone. It's a rental house, actually. One of those older 2-story places with thin walls and a utility basement that the landlord described as semi-finished, which really just means there's drywall on 2 sides and bare concrete on the other 2. I keep some boxes down there, an old bike I never ride, a dehumidifier that runs in summer. I didn't think about the light again that night. I went to sleep sometime around midnight, and I slept fine. The next morning I made coffee, worked from home, ordered Thai food for dinner, watched something on TV. Normal Tuesday becoming normal Wednesday. My girlfriend texted around 9 p.m. to say goodnight. I told her I missed her. I turned off the TV at around 11 and went upstairs. I was brushing my teeth when I heard something shift downstairs. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a bang or a crash. It was more like the sound furniture makes when someone adjusts their weight. That soft creak of something being pressed and then released. I stopped brushing and just stood there, toothbrush in my mouth, listening. The house settled into quiet. A car went by outside. The dehumidifier in the basement kicked on, and I heard the low mechanical hum travel up through the floor the way it always did. I told myself it was the house settling. Old houses do that. Everybody knows that. I spit, rinsed, turned the bathroom light off, stood in the dark hallway for a few seconds. Nothing. I went to bed. The next thing I registered was waking up at 2:47 a.m. to use the bathroom. I didn't turn the hall light on. I know the path by feel. I went into the bathroom, did what I needed to do, and on my way back to the bedroom, I stopped at the top of the stairs. I don't know why I stopped. There was no sound. There was nothing. I just stopped and looked down the staircase into the dark living room below, and I had this feeling. Not fear exactly. More like when you're reading and something at the edge of your vision moves, and you look up, but there's nothing there. That feeling of your attention being pulled somewhere it wasn't pointed. I stood there for maybe 15 seconds. Then I went back to bed. In the morning, I went downstairs and found that the chair at the kitchen table had been pulled out from the table by about 2 feet. Not knocked over, not askew, just pulled out. Like someone had sat in it. I have a habit of eating at the kitchen table when my girlfriend is home, and eating on the couch when she's away. I hadn't sat at that table since she'd left. I was almost certain of it. I stood in the kitchen holding a cup of coffee and staring at the chair, and I thought about all the ways I might have moved it and not noticed. Bumping into it, dragging it with my foot while reaching for something in a cabinet. I probably did something like that. I almost definitely did something like that. I pushed it back in and didn't think about it again for most of the day. By Thursday evening, though, I was starting to feel what I can only describe as a low-grade unease, the kind that doesn't have a clear source. I'd be sitting at my desk working, and I'd find myself glancing toward the staircase, or turning around in my chair for no reason. I wasn't scared. I just felt slightly watched, which is an unpleasant thing to feel in your own home. I went downstairs to make dinner around 7, and I noticed the basement door was open. Not wide open, just slightly. Maybe an inch, maybe two. Enough that I could see the darkness on the other side of it. I stood in the kitchen and stared at it for a long moment. That door had a latch that required you to fully turn the handle and pull. It didn't swing open on its own. I knew that because when we first moved in, I tried to prop it open with my foot while carrying boxes, and it had swung shut twice before I gave up and started making 2 trips. It wasn't the kind of door that drifted open. I walked over to it. I pushed it shut. I heard the latch click, and then I stood there with my hand still on the door handle, and I listened. The water heater glowed orange in the dark. The shelving unit held its familiar clutter of toolboxes and old cables. The pull-down door in the floor was closed. I reached up and pulled the string for the overhead light and looked at the latch on the pull-down door, and the latch was closed, and something in me relaxed by several degrees. I was about to leave when I noticed the mat in front of the water heater. It was a utility mat, just a rubber anti-fatigue thing I'd put down so I wasn't standing on concrete when I had to fiddle with the water heater settings. It was always in front of the heater, flush against it. Right now, it was pushed to the side by several inches, and there was a fine half-arc of dust on the concrete where it had been dragged. Like someone had moved the mat to stand in front of the pull-down door and then pushed it aside. I looked at the pull-down door. Closed. Latched. I looked at the mat. I turned off the light. I went back to my room. I locked the door. I did not sleep again. In the morning, I called my landlord and asked if anyone else had a key to the house. He said no, just me and the spare he kept in his office. I asked if the utility closet had any access points I didn't know about. He paused and said there was a crawl space that connected to the one next door, but it had been sealed years ago. He asked why I was asking. I didn't fully answer him. Instead, I called a friend who lives across town and asked if I could stay with him for a few days. He said, of course, no questions. I packed a bag, took my laptop, left every light in the house on, and I did not go back until my girlfriend returned the following Wednesday. When she came back, we went through the house together. We didn't find anyone. The basement was empty. The utility closet was the same as always. Mat back in position, pull-down latch closed. She thought I'd spooked myself. She was kind about it, didn't make me feel stupid. She probably wasn't wrong. But I had a locksmith come out the following week and rekey every lock in the house. And I bought a contact alarm for the basement door, the kind that screams if it's opened. I installed it the day it arrived, and I've been sleeping a little better since then. A little better. Not the same. My neighborhood isn't the kind of place where you worry much. It's suburban in the most unremarkable sense of the word. Cul-de-sacs, 2-car garages, a park down the road where people walk dogs in the morning. I'd lived there for 6 years with my husband, and before him, I'd lived there alone for 2 years. And in all that time, nothing had ever happened. Not a break-in on the street, not so much as a vandalized mailbox. It was exactly as quiet and forgettable as it sounds. My husband was in Cleveland for a work conference. He left Thursday morning and wasn't coming back until Sunday. It was now Friday, almost midnight, and I was on the couch in the living room watching something on my laptop because I'd never been able to sleep well when the house was this quiet. The curtains on the front window were closed. They're heavy blackout curtains, the kind you buy when the streetlight outside your house is positioned in exactly the wrong place. They block almost everything, but at the bottom there's always been a small gap, maybe 2 inches, where the curtain doesn't quite reach the sill. I'd meant to fix that for years. I'd even bought extra curtain clips and then left them in a drawer. At 11:48 p.m., I noticed someone walk past that gap. Just feet. Just the lower half of someone's legs, passing from left to right at a walking pace. I see that sometimes. Neighbors coming home late, people cutting through on their way to the park. I noticed it without really registering it and went back to my show. At 11:54 p.m., I saw feet again. Same direction, right to left this time. I paused my show. People do walk back and forth. People pace on phone calls. People forget something in their car and go back for it. I was telling myself all of this in real time, very calmly, the way you do when you want to make sure you don't feel what you're starting to feel. I sat with it for a moment, then I went back to my show. At 12:03 a.m., the feet passed again. Left to right. I closed my laptop. I sat in the quiet and I thought about it. 3 passes in 15 minutes, the last 2 in opposite directions. That wasn't someone walking somewhere. That was someone moving back and forth in front of my house. And the window they were passing was the only lit window on my front face. My laptop's glow would have been visible even through the curtains. I got up and turned the lamp off. I stood in the dark living room and I went to the window and I moved the edge of the curtain 1/4 of an inch and I looked outside. There was a woman standing at the end of my front walkway. She was maybe 30 feet away, facing the house. I couldn't make out her face clearly in the streetlight. I registered dark clothing, medium height, still. Just standing there, looking at the house, I let the curtain fall. I stood with my back against the wall in the dark, and I thought about what I'd just seen. A woman standing on the public sidewalk at the end of my walkway at midnight, looking at my house. That was all. People do strange things at midnight. She could be waiting for a ride. She could be on the phone. She could be looking at her own phone and just happened to be facing my direction. I waited about a minute and then I looked again. She hadn't moved. She was still facing the house and she was closer. She was on the walkway now, maybe 15 feet from the front door. I moved away from the window. I went to the front door and checked that it was deadbolted, which it was. I went to the side door, the one that opens into the garage, and checked it. Also locked. The garage itself was closed. I checked the back slider and it was locked. I did all of this quietly and without turning any lights on. When I came back to the living room, I looked out the window again. She was gone. I stood there and I looked up and down the street as far as I could see. Nothing. No movement. The street was empty. This is the part I have trouble explaining because what happened next wasn't dangerous. Nothing happened to me. But the feeling I had for the next 4 hours was one of the worst feelings I've ever experienced in that house. And it was almost entirely because of the not knowing. I didn't know where she went. She hadn't walked off down the street. I was watching within 30 seconds and the street was empty. She hadn't had time to reach the end of the block, not walking. She could have gone around the side of the house. She could have cut between houses. She could have gotten into a car I didn't hear. She just wasn't there anymore. I called my husband. It was almost 12:30 a.m. and he answered on the 3rd ring, groggy. I told him what had happened. He listened. He asked if the doors were locked. I said yes. He asked if I wanted him to come home, which would have meant a 5-hour drive, and I said no, not yet. He asked if I wanted to call the police, and I said I didn't know what I would tell them. A woman stood on my walkway and then left. That's not a crime. That's not even an incident. He stayed on the phone with me for an hour, mostly quiet, while I sat in the kitchen with every light on. Around 1:30, I heard something at the back of the house. Not inside. Outside. The back patio. A wooden deck that runs along the entire back of the house. You can hear footsteps on it clearly from the kitchen. What I heard was 3 or 4 slow, weighted steps, and then nothing. I told my husband what I'd heard. He told me to call 911. I did. I was already on with them when I heard the steps again, quicker this time, and then a sound like something dragging against the deck railing. The police arrived in 9 minutes. They found nothing on the deck and no one in the yard. But they did find a footprint in the flower bed below the kitchen window. One print, pressed deep into the soil, pointing toward the window. Someone had stood there and leaned in. The window was locked. There was nothing on the glass. The officer who took my statement was straightforward about it. He said it was probably a neighborhood kid or someone who'd had too much to drink, got spooked when I called it in, and left. He wasn't dismissive exactly. He was just practical, in the way people who respond to calls at 1:30 in the morning tend to be. He said there was no sign of attempted entry and no ongoing threat. He was probably right. I went to my sister's house that night. I haven't thought about what would have happened if I'd stayed because there's no point. But I did have a security camera installed the week after, covering both the front and the back. And I've thought about that woman. The way she was just standing there, facing the house, not doing anything, at midnight. More times than I'd like to admit. The not doing anything is the part that stayed with me. It would have been easier somehow if she'd been trying something. At least then there would have been a clear explanation. But she was just standing there, looking. And then she was gone. And someone was standing in my flower bed. I don't know how those two things connect. I'm not entirely sure they do. My parents' house is the kind of old that real estate agents describe as full of character. It was built in 1941, added onto twice, once in the 60s and once in the 80s. And the result is a layout that doesn't quite make sense, with hallways that seem a foot too long and a bathroom wedged into a space that was clearly an afterthought. I grew up in it. I know it the way you know somewhere you've spent your whole childhood, which is to say, I know it well enough that I mostly stopped seeing it. Everyone was at my cousin's wedding in Savannah. My parents, my brother, his girlfriend, my aunt and uncle who were staying with us. All of them had driven down Friday morning and were coming back Sunday evening. I'd gotten out of it because I had a licensing exam Monday morning and needed the weekend to study. My mom had made me promise to eat real food and not just cereal. I told her I would. It was Saturday, 10 a.m., maybe 10:30. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop and two highlighters and a study guide I'd been staring at for 45 minutes without retaining anything. The house was extremely quiet in the particular way that large houses get when everyone leaves them. Not uncomfortable quiet, just spacious. I made more coffee, sat back down, read the same paragraph about corporate liability 3 times. That's when I heard movement in the attic. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because the word movement might make it sound more dramatic than it was. It was a slow, low sound, like something shifting its weight, like the settling sound a house makes, except with a directionality to it, starting over the kitchen and then moving steadily toward the living room above me. I looked up at the ceiling. The attic is accessible through a hatch in the hallway ceiling at the top of the stairs. A fold-down staircase, the kind with the string pull. I'd been up there a handful of times in my life, and it was what you'd expect. Pink insulation, exposed joists, Christmas decorations in plastic tubs, luggage, a broken stationary bike my dad had been claiming he'd fixed since 2009. The sound stopped. I looked back at my laptop. Squirrels on the roof. Birds. Something nesting in the eaves. It happens every spring, and my dad was always complaining about it. The house made sounds. That was not a new development. I went back to corporate liability. 15 minutes later, I heard it again. This time, it was different. Less like shifting and more like steps. Slow. 4 or 5 of them, coming from the area above the hallway. And then, very clearly, a sound that I can only describe as something being set down. A deliberate sound. Not a drop or a crash, but the sound of something being placed carefully onto a surface. I sat very still. The thing is, the attic floor, such as it is mostly just the top surface of the ceiling drywall, which isn't designed to hold weight. There are boards running between the joists near the hatch, but beyond that, it's just insulation and drywall and not something you'd want to walk on. My dad had told me that once when I was a kid, and I'd always remembered it because he'd made it sound catastrophic. You walk on the wrong spot and you're going through the ceiling. So anything moving in the attic with weight, actual deliberate weight, was either on those boards near the hatch or it was risking a fall through the ceiling. My phone was on the table in front of me. 10:52 a.m. full battery. I thought about animals. I thought about how sometimes raccoons get into attics. You hear about it all the time. They're heavier than squirrels. They move differently. They can manipulate things. But raccoons don't place things carefully. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I went upstairs. The hallway was bright from the window at the end of it. Full mid-morning sun, which sounds reassuring and wasn't. I stood below the attic hatch and looked up at it. The string hung down the way it always did. The hatch was closed. I listened. Nothing from above. I stood there for almost 2 minutes. Then I pulled the string. The stairs unfolded downward with their usual groan, which sounds like a horror movie thing to say, except it's just the noise they always make because they're old and the spring tension is off. I stood at the bottom looking up into the rectangle of attic space above me. It was lit only by the daylight filtering through the 2 small gable vents on either end, which gave it that particular attic light. Dusty, sourceless, a little yellow. I didn't go up. I just stood there, and I listened. Nothing. I waited. Nothing. I called up, hello? Which felt foolish the moment I said it, and felt less foolish a moment later when I thought about why I'd said it. No answer. I stood there at the bottom of the folded stairs, and I thought about what I was doing. It was 11 in the morning. It was bright outside. I was 26 years old, and I'd grown up in this house, and I was standing in a sunlit hallway listening to nothing. I went up 2 steps, just enough to get my head above the hatch opening. I looked around. The attic was the attic. The plastic tubs, the luggage, the broken exercise bike. Insulation pink and undisturbed. Dust motes moving in the light from the vents. Nothing out of place, no animal, no sign of entry. But one of the plastic tubs, the large red one closest to the hatch, the one that held the Christmas lights, had been moved. It had always sat flush against the joist beam, and now it was pulled out by about a foot, positioned in the middle of the boarded area near the hatch, like someone had moved it to sit on it. I stared at it for a long time. Then I went back down, folded the stairs up, and stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I went into every room on the 2nd floor and checked it. All clear, all empty, windows locked. I went downstairs and checked every room on the ground floor. I checked all the entry points. Everything was locked and undisturbed. I got my phone and I went and sat in my car in the driveway. I think about this next part a lot. Sitting in my car in the driveway of my childhood home on a Saturday morning in November with the sun coming through the windshield and the radio off, trying to figure out what to do. I had no reason to think anyone was in the house. I had looked at every room, but I also knew I hadn't gone into the attic fully, and I knew what I'd heard, and I knew that tub had been moved. I called my dad. He didn't answer. I called my mom. She answered on the 4th ring at a wedding venue somewhere in Savannah, and I could hear music and voices behind her. I told her I'd heard something in the attic and that one of the storage containers had been moved. She was quiet for a second, and then she said, "I moved that when I was looking for the guest towels last weekend. I meant to push it back." I sat with that. "And the sounds," she said, "could be the Hendersons. They had someone on their roof last week for the gutters. Sound travels weird between those houses." I sat in the car a little longer after we hung up, ran it all through again. My mom had moved the bin. There were roofers or gutter people next door. 2 explanations, both plausible, both mundane. And yet, I kept coming back to that particular sound. The thing being set down carefully. The deliberate weight of it. Raccoons don't do that. Gutter work from next door doesn't travel with that kind of directionality. And my mom had moved the bin a week ago, so it had been sitting in the middle of the boarded area for an entire week, which didn't explain why I hadn't noticed it before, except I hadn't been up there before. I had no way of knowing when I'd last looked. I went inside, I made a sandwich. I studied until 4 p.m., and then I called a friend and told her I needed to get out of the house, and we went and got dinner, and I came back at 8 and went to sleep with my bedroom door locked. My parents came home Sunday evening. My dad went up to the attic that night to move a suitcase. He called down to me while he was up there and said everything looked normal. I said, okay. I asked him if he'd noticed anything unusual up there lately. He came down and looked at me. Like what? I said, I don't know. Anything out of place? He thought about it and said no, not that he could think of. I asked him to check if the gable vents were intact. He frowned at me, went back up, came back down. They're both fine. I nodded. He went and watched television. I sat at the kitchen table where I'd been sitting Saturday morning in the same chair, and I looked up at the ceiling. The house above me was quiet. My parents' voices came from the living room, the TV, the sound of my dad's chair creaking. Everything was exactly as it should have been. I still don't know what I heard.